No more. On Christmas Day, as many of us were spending time with loved ones, Donald Trump used his day to rant on social media, so much that he wrote more than 100 posts that included many of his greatest hits, attacking his so-called enemies, lying about election results, and trying to say anything to take away from his Epstein problem. Donald Trump capped off his rant the next day, raging on social media that DOJ should say no more of the Epstein files and concentrate on other things like his 2020 election fantasia. But the Epstein files will never be no more, and even some of Donald Trump's closest allies know that it'll never be no more. In an interview in the New York Times Magazine, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's been one of Donald Trump's most loyal of supporters in Congress, said that the Epstein files are what caused her to break from Donald Trump. Robert Draper, writing for the New York Times Magazine, reports, quote, most significant, she defied the president and compliant House Republican leaders as she argued that all investigative material pertaining to Jeffrey Epstein should be released. The Epstein files represents everything wrong with the administration, Greene told me in December. Rich, powerful elites doing horrible things and getting away with it, and the women are the victims, end quote. Congresswoman Greene is resigning from her seat next Monday, January 5th. She believes Donald Trump turned on her after she became an advocate for the release of the Epstein files, along with our next guest, Congressman Ro Khanna. The White House gave this response to the New York Times Magazine over Congresswoman Greene's interview. Quote, Congresswoman Greene is quitting on her constituents in the middle of her term and abandoning the consequential fight we're in. We don't have time for her petty bitterness, end quote. Greene told the New York Times Magazine that she spoke to some Epstein survivors at a closed-door oversight committee hearing, and that's when everything changed for her. Quote, after the hearing, Greene held a news conference at which she threatened to identify some of the men who had abused the women. Greene says she didn't know those names herself, but that she could have gotten them from the victims. Trump called Greene to voice her displeasure. Trump called Greene to voice his displeasure. Greene was in her Capitol Hill office, and according to a staff member, everyone in the suite of rooms could hear him yelling at her as she listened to him on speakerphone. Greene says she expressed her perplexity over his intransigence. According to Greene, Trump replied, my friends will get hurt. My friends will get hurt. That was allegedly Donald Trump's main concern, according to Greene, for why the files should not be released. Not a concern for the victims, but rather Donald Trump's concern for his friends. Greene revealed this about her last phone call with Donald Trump. Quote, when she urged Trump to invite some of Epstein's female victims to the Oval Office, she says, he angrily informed her that they had done nothing to merit the honor. It would be the last conversation Greene and Trump would ever have. Nothing to merit the honor. Congresswoman Greene continued to fight for justice for the Epstein survivors and did not cave to Donald Trump's pressure. She gave the New York Times this account of Trump's attempt to sway other Republican women. Quote, Greene's sudden isolation became evident on the afternoon of November 18 when the Epstein Files Transparency Act finally made it to the House floor after Trump abandoned the fight in the face of pressure brought by Greene, Massey, and two more Republicans, Nancy Mace and Lauren Boebert. They brought Lauren Boebert into the Situation Room. That was so weird, Greene recalled, of the White House attempts to persuade the holdouts to cave and cast their votes against bringing the bill to the floor. And they were calling Nancy Mace nonstop. She's running for governor. She has an endorsement on the line. I gave both of them a lot of credit. That Massey was the only male Republican to side with Epstein's victims on the vote was notable, Greene added. There's a significant reason why women overwhelmingly don't vote Republican, she said. I think there's a very big message here. New reporting in the Wall Street Journal in the last hour reveals new details about Jeffrey Epstein during the late 1990s and early 2000 when he frequently visited Mar-a-Lago. The Journal reports that employees at the Mar-a-Lago club warned each other that Epstein sometimes exposed himself during in-home spa appointments. The Journal also reports that Donald Trump's ex-wife, Marla Maples, voiced her concerns about Epstein's behavior. Quote, some of the former club employees said that Maples communicated her concerns to Timothy McDaniel, who worked as a bodyguard for the Trump family and oversaw security at their Florida properties. McDaniel didn't respond to requests for comments. Maples told Trump that she was uneasy about Epstein's presence and that she didn't want to spend time with him and didn't want Trump to either, according to former employees and people close to Maples. But Epstein continued to attend parties and events at Mar-a-Lago. Representatives from Marla Maples didn't respond to the Journal's request for comment. The White House told the Journal that Donald Trump, quote, did nothing wrong. Donald Trump has tried to distract from the Epstein files and is attempting to use the Justice Department to make it no more. But he's facing challenges at every turn. In just 4 days, the Trump Justice Department faces a new deadline. On Christmas Eve, the DOJ announced that they had millions more Epstein-related documents in their possession. Now the DOJ must answer to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees as to why they're still hiding documents from the public. The Bipartisan Epstein Files Transparency Act also says the DOJ must give Congress a summary of all redactions. The DOJ is, of course, trying to push back against the law, which demanded all documents be released by December the 19th. But members of Congress won't stop pushing for the full story on the Epstein files. Today, Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee sent a letter to Donald Trump's chief of staff, Susie Wiles, inquiring as to how she had read the Epstein files and confirmed that Donald Trump's name appears in them. And our next guest, the Congressman Ro Khanna, has confirmed that he will be filing inherent contempt proceedings against Pam Bondi once Congress returns to session, and will seek a special magistrate appointment from SDNY to review the DOJ's redactions in the Epstein files. Leading off our discussion tonight is the Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna of California. He's a member of the Oversight Committee. Congressman, great to see you. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Ali.
Congressman, a number of people have been sort of posting and asking what happens to members of the administration who seem to be working against the bill that requires them to release these files. You have one answer to that, and that is this filing of inherent contempt proceedings. Tell me about that.
Well, the inherent contempt that Massie and I will be filing would make Pam Bondi personally liable for $5,000 to $10,000 a day for every day that she does not release the files and comply. And it just requires a simple majority in the House. But the bigger point, Ali, is that when Massie and I, when we passed the bill, 427 to 1 in the House, 100 to 0 in the Senate, the president signed it. You can't just ignore the law. It's obstruction of justice. It can be criminally prosecuted, if not by this administration, then a future administration. So there is a lot of outrage, not just with survivors, but with Republicans at what is happening with the selective Epstein disclosure. And when we get back, we're going to push for full transparency.
What do you think motivates them? 427 to 1 in the House, 100 to nothing in the Senate. Remarkable frustration. I mean, we're using Marjorie Taylor Greene as an example, but she's just one example. There are lots and lots and lots of Republicans, as you predicted there would be, who are saying to themselves, I can't hold off against this tidal wave with my constituents. What's going on here?
Well, they're protecting the Epstein class. I mean, the president says it out loud. He says this is going to hurt a lot of people. This is going to hurt a lot of people who he knew, prominent bankers, prominent lawyers, prominent politicians, many of them in New York. And while the survivors haven't given me specific names, they've described the type of people in these files. Then people come on and say, well, are Khanna and Massie exaggerating? There's one way to find out. Just release the files. Release them. But that's what's going on here, is they want to protect the reputation of these rich and powerful men who showed up in Epstein's rape island and not have them take accountability.
Some remarkable reporting from the Wall Street Journal tonight, in which it says the club, meaning Mar-a-Lago, was also sending spa employees, usually young women, to Epstein's nearby mansion for massages, manicures, and other spa services, according to former Mar-a-Lago and Epstein employees. The house calls went on for years, even as spa employees warned each other about Epstein, who was known among staff for being sexually suggestive and exposing himself during the appointments, according to the former Mar-a-Lago employees. So this continues to be, I mean, obviously in these releases of files, we see photographs of Mar-a-Lago. This continues to be an issue, the ties between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. I haven't seen anything that suggests culpability on Donald Trump's part, but there's a whole lot of pushback and secrecy going on.
There is, and I haven't seen anything that suggests any culpability, but there's obviously evidence that there was a tie between Mar-a-Lago, a place that Trump reveres as his home, as his headquarters, and Epstein. And those documents need to come out. I mean, the Wall Street Journal reporting is just scratching the surface. All of this stuff is in the Florida criminal case. There was discovery. There are documents. All of it needs to come out. Here, first, Pam Bondi says it's all out. There's nothing more to see. Then there's Christmas Eve, a release saying, well, we've got 1 million more documents in New York. Well, there are millions of documents in this file. Kash Patel has said that, and it all needs to come out in the new year.
By the way, I was mentioning the photographs. Those are of Jeffrey Epstein's island and his estate, not of Mar-a-Lago. Let's talk about this 1 million pages that the Department of Justice says it still has. Have you heard anything that resembles an argument as to justify the delay of these files that were all supposed to be released by December 19th? Because as you said, Pam Bondi bragged that she had the files. She said they were on her desk. She said this in a public interview. So they've known for many, many months that this reckoning would come. What's the basis for continuing to delay?
Some of it is incompetence. I think they didn't know where all these files were. I mean, with the whole investigation, they never thought to get the documents from the Epstein estate. It was me coming on this program and talking to Bradley Edwards that we actually sent a letter to the Epstein estate. So some of it is incompetence. Some of it is they claim they're protecting the identities and the survivors. The reason that's not believable is they're not releasing what the survivors want, which is their statements to the FBI where they named these other men. So my concern is less the timeline. And if they came back and said, you know, Ro, we're releasing documents, it's taking us a little longer, but if they were actually giving us the witness statements, if they were actually being transparent, I'd have less of a problem. The problem is they're hiding things, and every time there's pushback, they suddenly find new documents, and they have the same strategy. They've had the same strategy since July. Let's just get this over with, say we're done, and everyone will forget. And then they find out that when they do that, there's more outrage, and the scandal just grows. And, you know, if I had any free advice for them, I'd say just get it all out there in January and let the truth come out.
Congressman, good to see you as always. Thank you for being with us. Congressman Ro Khanna of California. All right, coming up, the conservative Supreme Court ruling against him might have been one of the reasons that Donald Trump spent Christmas raging on the internet. You may have missed it over the holiday, but the Chief Justice, John Roberts, and Trump-appointed Justices Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh joined with the liberal justices to smack down one of Donald Trump's signature power grabs. I'll talk about that on the other side of the break. Tonight, more than 300 National Guard troops are in New Orleans in what Donald Trump claims is a security measure ahead of New Year's Eve. The move comes 1 year after a deadly terror attack on Bourbon Street that killed 14 people. And it's part of a broader push from the Trump administration to put U.S. military patrols on the streets of American cities amid his crackdown on mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. Donald Trump has been met with resistance from Democratic leaders in California and Texas and in Illinois, and now from the conservative Supreme Court. Last week, in a 6-3 preliminary order, the Supreme Court rejected Trump's attempts to deploy troops to the Chicago area, siding with Democrats who argued that Trump was overstepping his authority. Quote, "At this preliminary stage, the government has failed to identify a source of authority that would allow the military to execute the laws in Illinois. The president has not invoked a statute that provides an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act." That's the Supreme Court saying quite plainly, you don't get to do this just because you want to. Politico reports, quote, 3 conservative justices, Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch, dissented, while another conservative, Brett Kavanaugh, voted to deny Trump's request, but declined to join the majority's explanation of the ruling. Kavanaugh indicated he had had enough doubts about the administration's legal arguments that he agreed with denying the emergency stay that the federal government sought. In a concurring opinion, Justice Kavanaugh wrote, quote, "To federalize the National Guard, the president must first determine that he is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. In my view, the statutory term regular forces likely refers to the U.S. military, not to federal civilian law enforcement officers," end quote. So when the Trump administration argues that National Guard troops are needed to protect federal personnel and property from violent resistance against ICE agents, the Supreme Court is signaling that argument may not survive serious scrutiny. So far, more than 4,500 people have been arrested by federal immigration agents in the Chicago area as part of Trump's immigration raids this year. In response to this, the Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has enacted a new state law allowing residents to sue federal immigration agents if they believe their civil rights have been violated. The Trump Justice Department has filed a lawsuit to nullify that state law. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson, who will join us in a moment, said this about his fight to defend Chicago residents.
Every single lawsuit that we put up against the Trump administration, we prevailed, and everything that they brought against us, we were also to beat back. I said from the very beginning I was going to use every single tool available to me to protect all of Chicago, whether that's executive orders, which we've done, legislation, which we've done, including taking it to the court. And so we've said from the very beginning that this president was working outside the bounds of his executive authority. He has trampled on this Constitution. Working with our law department, including the state of Illinois, is proof positive that when we stand firm on our values, the people who are united around those values will always prevail.
Joining us now is the mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson. Mayor, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, and Happy New Year.
Thank you, Sir. What's the practical effect of this decision by the Supreme Court? Are we seeing the effects of it in the streets of Chicago yet?
Well, we certainly are. As I've said repeatedly, that this president has certainly worked outside of the confines of the Constitution. And I've maintained that position. And, thankfully, the Supreme Court sees it our way. And what we've said from the very beginning, if this president was actually sincere about addressing violence in the city of Chicago and cities across America, he would work with mayors like myself to do the things that actually work. And so, again, we've always maintained that this president was working outside of the confines of the Constitution, and we are certainly grateful that the Supreme Court sees it our way as well. So this is not just a benefit for the people of Chicago, but it's really a win for cities across America.
In very practical terms, what difference does it make? What has happened as a result of this decision? Has the Trump administration acknowledged or done anything about it?
Well, they have not acknowledged that this is, a real check and balance to the Trump administration. But what has happened practically is that we don't have to sit under the threat of our city and cities across America being occupied by federal troops. And quite frankly, they don't have policing power or policing authority. So what they would actually do was never even satisfied or determined. We saw what happened in Washington, D.C., where they, the National Guard participated in streets and sanitation. They helped people with their groceries. If that's what the president is committed to doing, then he should restore funding that goes towards the SNAP benefits, restoring health care, right? So in a very practical way, we don't have to deal with the ongoing threat of cities being occupied, and that we can actually ensure that our Constitution is not being eroded by an authoritarian, quite frankly, that has demonstrated that he's more committed to instituting terror than he is providing comfort for working people across this country.
So, in fact, you use the D.C. example. We've got New Orleans, obviously. One would argue that given that they don't have any policing powers, that the deployments of the National Guard are meant largely to either intimidate or prepare Americans for other instances in which the president is federalizing troops. And again, I think the distinction is unclear for some people because ICE seems to be doing Donald Trump's bidding, and he's trying to create a situation in which the National Guard can also do Donald Trump's bidding.
Look, I think your analysis is spot on. I mean, we saw the largest upward transfer of wealth into the hands of the ultra rich with his big, nasty, ugly bill. At the same time, he created funding for ICE that essentially has behaved as the Trump administration's personal privatized police force. In fact, the only other entities that are funded higher than ICE are the United States military and China's military. We know that this president has failed in every single aspect to provide real opportunities and hope for working people. Whether it's, groceries, whether it's healthcare, whether it's jobs, this president has been a failure. And so what this certainly signals is that that there is at least another branch of government that recognizes that the overreach by the president is a real threat to our democracy, but it's also a threat to our humanity. So, it's why we've been very clear that we're going to use every single tool available to us, whether it's, litigation or legislation or executive orders to protect the interests of working people. And that's what we've done in Chicago. And that's what, of course, that we need to see happen across this country.
Mayor, good to talk to you again. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson. All right, joining me now is Barbara McQuade, former United States attorney and law professor at the University of Michigan Law School. She's now an MS Now legal analyst. Barbara, thank you for joining us. I want to go back to the Supreme Court decision for a moment. This is important because a number of conservative justices pointed out that this is just not sound in the eyes of the law. The idea that Donald Trump was using the National Guard or wanted to use the National Guard in Chicago to carry out responsibilities that he did not demonstrate either the need for or the fact that the National Guard is statutorily allowed to undertake.
Yes, they engaged in some statutory interpretation. The key language here is that before the National Guard may come into a city, the president has to determine that he's unable to execute the law with, quote, regular forces. And the Trump administration has been interpreting that as meaning regular police forces. The ordinary police officers on the street aren't getting the job done. Therefore, we need to supplement them with members of the National Guard. What the court said here is, no, regular forces. That means regular military forces. That really ups the ante here. It says that, we're just not even on the same, it's not the same page. We're not in the same chapter. We're not in the same book here. Because before you can ever call up the military to execute the laws, that means you have to find some legal exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, the law that prohibits the military from executing the laws and engaging in law enforcement activities. That requires an invocation of the Insurrection Act, which is a much higher standard. The president has to find that there is some rebellion against the authority of the United States before he can invoke that power.
This is an important distinction. The concept of posse comitatus, it exists in many democracies around the world. The idea that the military is for protection of the country and for use against forces, generally speaking, out there, unless they invade your border or something, come across your border. And that policing is a civilian activity, that police answer to civilian authorities, not military authorities. I think a lot of people don't lose sleep over this, but it's an important distinction.
Yes. And, the founders were very concerned with this issue. And that's because during the colonial period, British soldiers would show up in their homes. It's why the Third Amendment says that people can't be required to quarter soldiers in their homes. They'd show up, they'd want a place to stay. They were engaging in policing on the streets and harassment on the streets. And so this idea, this distinction between police, which serves domestic purposes, and the military, which fights foreign enemies, was to be drawn very distinctly. The exception for this is very, very limited. And it is when the president has made this very high level declaration of a rebellion or some other combinations that are threatening the security of the United States.
Barbara, as always, thank you. We're clear after we hear from you on these things. Barbara McQuade, we appreciate your time.
Thanks, Allie.
All right, coming up, jobs are down, stocks are up, and the vibes are off. Even economists can't seem to figure out what's coming in the American economy, and that's not counting what could be the nail in the coffin of Trump's tariff chaos. That's next. The biggest economic jump ball in 2026 could be the coming Supreme Court decision on Donald Trump's tariffs. That decision could have a major effect on prices. If Trump's tariffs remain, some businesses that have been holding back on passing the import taxes on to consumers could relent and raise prices. Or if the tariffs are scrapped, it could spark a surge of business and consumer confidence. But one thing is for sure, as we head into 2026, the fate of the Trump tariffs are just one cloud of uncertainty hanging over the American economy. The Dow Jones crossed 48,000 for the first time ever recently, largely powered, by the way, by tech and AI bullishness. But the unemployment rate is the highest it's been in 4 years, with black unemployment now over 8%. That's as high as it was at the height of COVID. The all-important holiday shopping season was a mixed bag, by the way. The Associated Press reports, quote, that from November 1st through Sunday, December 21st, cash and credit card sales rose 4.2%, which is less than the 4.8% increase during the same period a year ago, according to Visa's Consulting and Analytics Division. When adjusted for inflation, retail sales rose a more modest 2.2% for the first 7 weeks of the holiday period, according to Visa's U.S. principal economist Michael Brown. That compares with the inflation-adjusted 3% in the same year-ago time frame. It's certainly not a spectacular season, Brown told the Associated Press. It's sort of an average holiday season, given concerns about macroeconomic growth and inflation. There's still a lot of uncertainty among the consumer population. Even economists at the Federal Reserve can't seem to agree about what's really going on in the economy. The New York Times reports today officials at the central bank have splintered over whether rising unemployment or elevated inflation poses the bigger economic risk. Ezra Klein focused on on this during his final 2025 podcast. The economic data, he says, has also become completely divorced from how people actually perceive the economy. If you look at consumer sentiment, people feel like the economy is as bad as it was in the depths of the previous recessions. And yet, the economic data, the job market, wages, inflation, all kind of look okay. It is the strangest year in the economy that I have ever covered. End quote. But the best expression of the economic uncertainty undoubtedly comes not just from economic reporters or from Fed board members, but from regular people, like this mailbag question economist Jared Bernstein received and posted on his Substack. America's economic vibes are awful. Hiring is way down. Prices are high and sticky, and the guy in the White House is certifiable. Yet GDP is banging. Please explain. Well, here to explain is Jared Bernstein. He's the former chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors in the Biden administration and a policy fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Jared, thank you for being with us. That was such a great question that you got in the mailbag, because it's such a great opportunity now for us to explain that while GDP is the largest measure we have of all economic activity in our economy, it doesn't tell you who's winning and it doesn't tell you who's losing. It just tells you this is happening.
Absolutely. It's a $30 trillion aggregate, which explains how folks at the bottom, middle, and the top are doing only in the sense that it reaches them. And if we have GDP growth that is largely just helping to elevate the yachts and leaving the rowboats behind, well, we're going to have a situation where the economy looks good by some of these aggregate numbers and yet feels pretty bad to a lot of people. 90% of stock market wealth is held by the top 10%. The bottom 50% owns almost nothing in terms of the stock market. So again, we have to look not simply at the aggregate indicators if we want to understand that gap, but how different groups are faring.
So let's talk about this, because 25 years ago, if you saw the stock market performing the way it is now, you would assume, whether you called it trickle down or the fact that people benefit from it, you would assume that that meant wealth was being spread around. As you point out, a little more than 50% of people hold stock, but you just gave me that statistic. 90% of stock market wealth goes to the wealthiest. The stock market is just not a great barometer of broad-based wealth creation.
Yeah, you're right that if you look at the share of people who own even a share of stock, sure, you can get above 50% pretty quickly. But if you look at the value, and now we're talking about, for example, tech shares, we know that the valuation of the Mag 7, these big tech companies, is over $20 trillion. That's over 2/3 of GDP, if you want to just give it some context. But the folks who are making off the most from those equity shares are the wealthiest. And the way that works in terms of the kinds of indicators we've been talking about, if you actually go around and see how big businesses are doing relative to small businesses, well, small businesses have been shedding jobs now for a while. Big businesses continue to plow ahead. If you ask folks who are tracking these consumer spending numbers that you just said a minute ago, retail trade and stuff, you'll find that in zip codes that are pretty wealthy, these stores are holding up pretty fine. But then if you look at some of the poor zip codes, you'll see a different result. So I do think that whether we're talking about consumer sales, affordability, healthcare, which is about to get a lot more expensive for a lot of people, you start to see this divide.
Jared, you talked about the Mag 7, the Magnificent Seven stocks. These are mainly AI, they're tech stocks, mainly AI-driven tech stocks, whether it's chips or companies that employ AI in their work. So if you take those out of the S&P 500 and you call it the S&P 493, the performance has been a lot less fancy. These are the Mag 7 stocks. Why does that matter? Because people who own stocks, generally speaking, will own an index like the S&P 500. So they're also gaining from the benefit in these companies. Why is it dangerous that 7 companies are so outperforming the entire rest of the stock market?
I'm glad you asked me that because it really feeds into everything we're talking about. I don't think it's particularly dangerous from the perspective of individual portfolios. I think it's dangerous from the perspective of the overall economy. One of the things that's been driving growth is called the wealth effect. And this is the idea that for every dollar of stock market wealth, something like 2 to 3 cents extra gets spent in the economy. Now, I did some calculations for the piece you showed me a minute ago, the piece I wrote the other day. The valuation of the S&P 500 is up almost 10 trillion. So if you take a couple percent of that, that's north of 200 billion. So that explains almost a quarter of the increase in consumer spending. So that kind of concentration and the wealth effect that's helping to drive consumer spending forward, it's more fragile than I'd like it to be, because if those firms start to stumble, that wealth effect could shift in reverse.
Yeah, it's worth paying attention to for all of us to see how big a role, whether or not you like AI or you're fearful of AI or you're hopeful for it, it is a massive piece of our economy right now, for better or for worse, and we need to pay attention to it. Jared, thanks as always. We appreciate it. The economist, Jared Bernstein. All right, coming up, Donald Trump lied repeatedly about hurricane relief in North Carolina in 2024, but this time the buck does stop with him. The former North Carolina Governor, Roy Cooper, now the Democratic candidate for Senate, joins me next. On his way from D.C. to Florida for Christmas, Donald Trump stopped in North Carolina to kick the tires on his 2026 midterm messaging in that state. The message was, blame the Democrats even though Trump is president and Republicans control the House and the Senate.
And after your horrible hurricane, which produced more water damage than any hurricane in history, the Democrats let you down. They really did. Remember, they wouldn't do anything. Remember? They wouldn't go to your community. They wouldn't do anything. You had to wait till January 20th when I took office. You'd still be sitting in the mud if I didn't get elected. You would be. People were sitting in the mud.
Lying about hurricane response in North Carolina is familiar territory for Donald Trump, who did it repeatedly in the final weeks of the presidential campaign. Vox reported back in October of 2024, since Hurricane Helene decimated parts of western North Carolina last week, former President Donald Trump has seized on the tragedy to perpetuate lies about the federal response, sowing chaos and confusion as officials scramble to help those affected. In recent days, Trump has repeatedly and falsely suggested that the federal government is purposely neglecting areas with Republican voters, that it is funneling emergency aid to migrants instead of to disaster response, and that it's giving hurricane victims just $750 in support. None of these claims are true. After those lies, Trump went on to win North Carolina by 3 points. Now, a new Washington Post report is detailing how Donald Trump is not quite the savior he claims to be. In November 2024, Elizabeth Clark was among the first storm victims in her county to apply for a voluntary program funded by the Federal Emergency Management Agency that would enable the government to buy out her property. More than 800 storm victims around Helene-battered western North Carolina have applied under FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. State officials vetted applications and began sending them up the chain to FEMA as far back as February. As of December 15th, they had sent nearly 600 buyout requests to Washington, with more likely to follow. So far, they say, not a single approval has come through. In a response to the Post, FEMA said, quote, it had provided $16.3 million in hazard mitigation, but when it came to the hundreds of pending applications from homeowners hoping for buyouts, the agency said they had not met federal requirements. The agency did not elaborate on why, end quote. It is, of course, Donald Trump and his chainsaw pal Elon Musk who've wreaked havoc on FEMA staffing and financing. But in Rocky Mount on December 19th, Donald Trump told voters it was all going great. And, of course, he did it all.
I did it all with your congressman and with a couple of Republicans from your state that put their lives on the line to make sure this got done.
Joining me now is the former Governor Roy Cooper. He's a candidate for the U.S. Senate in North Carolina. Governor, thank you for being with us. I appreciate it. I'm a little surprised, as they say in the South, that this dog actually hunts. North Carolinians, I think, have a pretty clear view of what happened after that hurricane and what Donald Trump was saying about it, and the fact that those two things are not the same.
You're right. That dog doesn't hunt, Allie. In fact, this was a big blow to Western North Carolina, the largest natural disaster ever. And that misinformation and those lies that had been stirred up demoralized people who were working so hard. State and local government and volunteers were putting in the time. It also discouraged people from applying for help. Then Donald Trump gets elected as president and comes into North Carolina and says that we're going to slash through every bureaucratic barrier to make sure we rebuild Western North Carolina better than it ever was. And what does he do? He appoints the consummate Washington, D.C. insider, my opponent, Michael Whatley, in the Senate race, to be the Western North Carolina recovery czar. It's been a failure at every turn. In fact, local governments are waiting to be reimbursed, all of them operating on tight budgets. You just heard about the 800 applications that are waiting for approval. It's hard to handle these buyouts at the state and local level, and they have to do most of the work. All the federal government has to do is approve it and send a check. They can't even do that. It's gotten so bad that there have been bipartisan calls and signing a petition to ask Michael Whatley to resign from his position. Look, we need people in the United States Senate who need to work on cutting red tape for real. Michael Whatley is on a council appointed by the president to reform FEMA. They haven't even come up with a report, much less have they done anything. And people in Western North Carolina are still hurting. They're doing an amazing job on their own, but only 11% of the recovery has been funded by the federal government, and storms like Katrina and Sandy had 70% of help from the federal government. It's time for the federal government to step up and help Western North Carolina. And if you want a senator who's going to work on that, you can go to roycooper.com and learn about what we're going to do and help us out.
I remember in your years as governor, you and I talked several times right after hurricanes or during natural disasters, as I did with many of your fellow governors in the South. And it was kind of interesting to me that that was the moment in which partisan nonsense was generally suspended for a couple of reasons. One is these are human tragedies. And two, you have to work with everybody in your state. When something like that happens, you can dig into why things went wrong, but fundamentally it is not a partisan activity. Donald Trump was making this a partisan problem as it happened.
No question. And in fact, this hurricane occurred at the end of September. Obviously, the November elections were right around the corner. And I think the president took advantage of that to lay into the previous administration. And really, he was criticizing everybody who was involved in this and promised that he would do better. Fact of the matter is, they have not done better. And in fact, things are much worse. Washington is broken. We need problem solvers to be elected to go to the United States Senate, to put the checks and balances back into the Constitution, to make sure this executive is doing its job right. And those of us who've served as governor, who've been through these natural disasters, know how complicated it can be. The last thing you need is an unresponsive federal government, and that's what we have right now.
You and I talked on the night of December 19th when Donald Trump had his rally in Rocky Mount. I didn't know at the time that he said this about you, but he did. He said, your previous governor, referring to you, was a disaster. He was a radical left person, by the way. He's radical left. You don't want him. He doesn't represent you. I've known you for a lot of years. I don't recall anybody calling you radical left.
No, that's the first. I think he's coined that phrase. What I'm going to be is the kind of senator who's going to be a strong, independent senator who's going to work with this president whenever I can. I'm going to stand up to him when I need to. My opponent will be the president's yes man. My opponent is the anointed pick of Donald Trump, and he knows that Michael Whatley will do whatever he tells him to do. I don't think the people of North Carolina want that. They know me serving as the chief law enforcement officer of our state, as attorney general, and as governor, and I'm going to work on bringing their costs down, protecting the health care that we've gotten in North Carolina. We were able to get a bipartisan agreement in our state to get 700,000 more people health insurance. Now all of that is in danger because of the big, beautiful bill that they just passed. It's another reason why I knew I needed to step up and run for this U.S. Senate seat to fix those problems and protect the success that we've made in North Carolina.
So until 2025, when I wanted to describe to people how perverse some of this partisan gerrymandering would be, I would use North Carolina as an example, because we pointed out Donald Trump won by 3 points. Republicans often win at that level. But you were governor and you were the attorney general. The current governor was also the attorney general. And in all of those instances, you won statewide elections in which both your legislatures are overwhelmingly, in fact, veto-proof Republican. So there's sort of proof of why gerrymandering is a problem.
Extreme partisan gerrymandering hurts our democracy. It hurts public policy. For the brief period of time that we had fair congressional maps in North Carolina, court-ordered fair maps, we sent 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans to Washington. Now that opinion has been struck back down, the Republicans have taken over. It is likely to be 11 Republicans and 3 Democrats. That's not North Carolina. We are a purple state. When you have these gerrymandered districts, you have representatives who spend more time catering to the extremes of their party rather than trying to work together to solve problems. We need a constitutional amendment to outlaw extreme partisan gerrymandering. I wish we'd won the Supreme Court case that was up there at the time that was a close loss. But I think that would be one of the best things we could do to protect our democracy.
Governor, good to see you as always. Thank you for being with us. The North Carolina Democratic Senate candidate and the former governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper. All right, we'll be right back. And that is tonight's last word.